Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad that I can come on here and talk to you about this. A little bit of orientation for those who aren't aware. This legislation that we're talking about of Canadian pharmaceuticals being brought up is in regards to whether or not we should allow these Canadian pharmaceuticals to come over the border and whether or not that should be made illegal. That is always a matter of discussion when we're talking about things transferring over borders. Anything. I mean, we talk about this when we talk about any raw materials with metals, everything else. Trade amongst countries is always a discussion that involves whether or not we should allow that to take place. I think this also has to be brought into context of whether or not we're talking about the purview of government and what the government is supposed to do for us. The government is here to protect us. So, in regards to the responsibilities of the government protecting us, what are they protecting us from? When we're talking about this, we would, pharmaceuticals, medications, drugs like this, we want to know that we're being protected from having impure or inappropriate or poisonous drugs being given to us. Now, according to the Canadian Pharmaceutical and Healthcare reports, we know that these are the same pharmaceutical companies that we already buy medications from here in the United States. It's not like we're suddenly being poisoned. It's not like these are different substances. They have the same lot numbers. They're literally being manufactured on the same lines at the same companies, and then they're sold to Canada. And these Canadian pharmacies are then selling them back to United States residents at way less costs than what they're being forced to pay within pharmacies in the United States. So the quality of drugs is not the question at all. The only difference that we can find amongst any of these medications is in cost. The cost of the medications is a point of reference that we shouldn't necessarily be protected from. It's less in Canada, and substantially less so. We're talking about 75% less. In some cases, one quarter or one third of the cost for the medications. So the question that we have to ask then when we're talking about legislating whether or not those pharmaceuticals should be allowed to cross back over the border into the United States is really a matter of, should the government be protecting us from saving money? Or should the government be protecting us from, not spending or being exploited by these big pharma companies? But why is the cost so much different? Well, that comes down to, according to the Journal of Economic Issues, we're talking about the difference in cost being because of regulations that are already on the books. We already cause all of these pharmaceutical companies to go through all kinds of legal loopholes. They have to get FDA approval to be sold in the United States. And then once they get this FDA approval, they have a monopoly on the market. The reason why they can't sell these drugs as expensively in Canada, and the reason why it's less expensive in general in Canada, is because they have other competitors who have not gained FDA approval, but these competitors force them to drive their costs down in order to remain competitive within the Canadian healthcare market. We have moats. We've set up monopolies that are government protected within our own country, and that causes the costs to remain high. They can exploit the American consumer based on that moat. So the issue that we have to talk about is the impact. And when you start dealing with the fact that we have a 77-year-old, in the case of Helen Clark, who is able to buy her Lipitor in Canada for $500 for a 6-month supply. But when she comes back to the United States, that same supply costs $1,900. Essentially, these type of regulations, this type of legislation, allows these big pharmaceutical companies to exploit a Helen Clark for $1,400 extra every time she buys the medication. And this is a 77-year-old woman who's living on a fixed income. She's nearly poverty-stricken. She's living on Social Security and welfare. And we want this to be allowed, that she can be exploited for that extra money. And I don't think that's necessarily the moral case that we need to be making right now. Now, ultimately, the reason why that's allowed to take place is because those big pharmaceutical companies have lobbyists. They have big pharmaceutical lobbyists up there working and fighting for them. And according to the Journal of Economic Issues, that's exactly why they're able to exploit the customer for that extra money. So impact matters. Essentially, they're able to exploit customers, and that's not what the government should be protecting us from. That's not their purpose, and that's not why they're here. I'll send it back to you. Thank you for having me.